Las Vegas, Sin City, a town known for its glitz, glamour, and gambling. But you don't know about this. Just 10 miles away, behind razor wire and armed guards, with an amazing view of the famous Strip, a wealthy entrepreneur is taking a gamble of his own. It's one he intends to win. Robert Bigelow is building commercial space stations. He wants to launch them from Cape Canaveral within the next few years. They'd be frontier outposts that would let both countries and corporations join the U.S., Russia, and others in space.
We hope to build a number of commercial space stations, not just one or two. We'd like to have 10 or 15 or 20.
And he's not alone. Private industry is looking at next year's retirement of the space shuttle fleet as an opportunity to turn space travel into a business. Companies are competing for a foothold in this new era of commercial space, and they range from plucky upstarts to established aerospace giants. Take a 5-hour drive southwest of Bigelow's Vegas compound, and just outside Los Angeles, you'll find Phantom Works. This secretive division of Boeing is building space taxis. They're designed to ferry U.S. astronauts and paying tourists into orbit. Not far from Boeing's Huntington Beach location, in a building in Hawthorne where they used to build 747 jets, another company's getting off the ground. Elon Musk, one of the founders of PayPal, runs SpaceX. Right now, workers here are building their Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon spacecraft. That combo could also ferry people on round trips to the International Space Station, or ISS.
We have a cargo version of the Dragon that is currently on contract to NASA to deliver cargo to the International Space Station. We'd like to modify that vehicle to be able to carry crews into space.
It's a new era, one of space exploration by entrepreneurs, not government agencies. Private companies will be operating these space liners, not NASA. Any government astronauts would buy a ticket to ride, just like everyone else. Bigelow, Boeing, SpaceX, Virgin Galactic, and X-Corp are some of the companies out west vying for private sector space dollars. They'd also love to take on NASA and the U.S. government as paying customers. A NASA office designed to encourage these commercial space flights is based at Kennedy Space Center. The Cape's launch pads are laden with history. Many are hoping these companies will launch from KSC and create aerospace jobs in Brevard County. The ultimate goal? One day, an average person will be able to taxi their way into space.
People want to be a part of something greater than themselves. It's in our DNA. We need it. We need heroes. It's required of humans. Societies that continue to advance continue taking great risks.
America's space shuttle fleet is about to shut down for good. After that, NASA will have to pay Russia to fly American astronauts to the space station. That internationally awkward arrangement will last at least the next few years. U.S. government astronauts will be riding in Russian-built Soyuz spaceships.
Right now, NASA and the American taxpayers have spent about $800 million on seats and given that money to the Russians. And the price that they're paying currently for a seat is over $56 million per seat, per astronaut, per flight. So the idea is, well, why not have American industry benefit from being able to sell NASA seats to the International Space Station, and why pump up a foreign industry?
What if something happens with the Soyuz? How are the crews going to go back and forth to the space station? We don't want to get into a position where we've got a multi-billion-dollar investment on orbit that we can't get crews to or from.
Enter American industry. Several of these aerospace companies believe it's time for the government to hand over some of the work it does, like rides to and from the space station, to private industry. They say that would free NASA up to focus on other bold new tasks like exploring deep space.
I would compare that back into the early days of aviation, where the first airplanes, the first airplane developments were really government sponsored, but then that was able to stimulate private enterprise to use a new mode of transportation to do whatever new economic things that we can try and do. And it's almost sad to say that we've been doing human spaceflight in America for 40 or 50 years now, and we've never made that transition between a government-sponsored activity, transitioning that to more of a private-dominated activity.
Under President Barack Obama's space plan, released in February, these companies will get that opportunity. The president set a new course for the space program. It calls for the private sector to have a big role in developing these space taxis. The commercial spaceships would fly astronauts to and from the International Space Station. His plan added $6 billion over 5 years to NASA's budget and canceled the moon program launched by the Bush administration in 2004. After months of debate, Congress approved a policy. It goes along with the president's plan, but it calls for less money than he would have liked for private companies.
Now, I recognize that some have said it is unfeasible or unwise to work with the private sector in this way. I disagree. The truth is, NASA has always relied on private industry to help design and build the vehicles that carry astronauts to space. By buying the services of space transportation, rather than the vehicles themselves, we can continue to ensure rigorous safety standards are met, but we will also accelerate the pace of innovations as companies, from young startups to established leaders, compete to design and build and launch new means of carrying people and materials out of our atmosphere.
We now have a NASA budget with a carved-out $6 billion budget. It was a bold move by this president. And it's now available through various programs and prizes for the private sector to compete for what you could loosely describe as repeatable portions of the space business. Now, are they ready to step up and start flying them today? No. But the irony is, neither's NASA. We've arrived at a point where NASA can't, and the private sector isn't ready, but it's budding. It's right there in front of us with a number of players.
Buying rides for government astronauts on these space taxis will be the job of a NASA office at Kennedy Space Center.
Is U.S. commercial industry up to the challenge? Absolutely. I think that we have a great technical capability, an outstanding workforce. The knowledge is there, and they're going to rise to the challenge and be successful.
And that could be good news for the Sunshine State.
I think it's an enormous opportunity for the state of Florida. You know, my hope is that we're shifting into a new kind of a space economy, not the old one program economy where everybody worked on shuttle or they weren't working in space. You know, I'd love to see an economy where you have a broad diversity of different projects, both commercial and in support of the government.
Still in its infancy, the industry that aims to send tourists into the emptiness of space traces its roots to one of the most desolate places on Earth, the Mojave Desert. Here at the Mojave Air and Spaceport, the first commercial non-government astronaut took off. He reached the edge of space on June 21, 2004. His ship was funded by the billionaire co-founder of Microsoft, Paul Allen. It was built by Scaled Composites, an aviation company run by aerospace maverick Burt Rutan.
And we had people from all over. When Bert and I went out at 3 in the morning parking cars, and just to park the first 100 cars, and it was his idea, just to see who was showing up. And I think the first car was from St. George, Utah, and a guy from Abilene, Texas. There was a guy from Beaumont, Texas, and his family, and they had literally thrown everything in the car and made the drive. People from South Dakota, Los Angeles, San Francisco. It's fascinating.
Later that day, pilot Mike Melville flew into the history books. The carrier plane White Knight 1 released Spaceship 1. Its rocket engines glowed and hurtled Melville to 100 kilometers above the Earth. Now they, along with other companies like fellow desert dwellers X-Corp Aerospace, want to start up space lines. They'd fly tourists on short jaunts to space in the next few years.
It's really like the stories of the early days of Silicon Valley, where there's a concentration of companies all doing the same things. Yeah, this is where it's at right now.
For 50 years, NASA has been responsible for overseeing every detail, the designing and the flying of the rockets and spaceships used to launch U.S. astronauts. Now the Obama administration aims to turn that job over to the private sector. Some question whether a profit-seeking company will take every step needed to make sure the crew on board is safe.
It's sometimes very frustrating for me to see commentary from people out there who are not informed about the industry, speculating that somehow because we are a for-profit entity that we will be motivated to cut corners on safety. In fact, the reverse is true. Agencies that are government funded receive their funding generally whether they have an accident or not. Agencies or entities such as ourselves that are commercially funded, where if we do not perform, we will not stay in business.
It's not like we're just saying, go build us a spacecraft and we'll fly it. We're going to be very involved in the design and development of the spacecraft and the processing and building of it. So it's not like we're not involved. We're going to be very involved.
That assurance is good enough for former NASA astronaut Winston Scott. He says he would take a ride on a commercial taxi.
Yes, because I believe that at the point when they are available and viable, they will have passed certain tests, they will have met certain safety and reliability requirements that I would fly on them.
Boeing and its predecessor companies have had a hand in building every spacecraft U.S. astronauts have flown in during the past 5 decades. They built the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo capsules, as well as the winged space shuttle orbiters and all the U.S. modules of the International Space Station. Now Boeing is developing a next-generation capsule for NASA. It's part of the Commercial Crew Development Program, known as CC-DEV. It would ferry astronauts to the ISS, as well as the private space stations, envisioned by Bigelow, who's working outside Las Vegas.
At a distance, what you see here looks basically like an Apollo. There's a lot of the design cues that we're basing on the Apollo. As we go closer and closer into some of the details, you'll find that we've changed quite a bit from that specific design, but the architecture is pretty similar.
This is the Venus Lab, also known as the Autonomous Systems Lab. We'll be doing a lot of the testing and integration of the rendezvous system for CC-DEV here in this facility. The system that we're working on is what actually enables the CC-DEV capsule to dock with the space station. So this is a 1/4 scale mock-up of the pressurized mating adapter, PMA-2, that's currently located on station. It's very important because if you cannot dock with the station, you can't accomplish your mission.
What we see behind me here is a heat shield demonstration unit that we're using to demonstrate the near full-scale manufacturing process of the ablative thermal protection system material that's going to go on the bottom of the spacecraft to protect it during the heat of re-entry.
We are looking at the lower half of the CC-DEV test article, and what we'll be doing here over the next several days with our engineers and technicians is going through assembly, instrumentation, which should be primarily installing strain gauges on the test article, and then we will be supporting some leak checks of the seal of the vehicle as well here.
At this facility, we're completing the upper section of the crew module development pressure vessel. And as you can see, we're nearing completion. This will be joined to the lower section that we saw earlier. I think using the methods that we have developed and are demonstrating on the CC-DEV program that we should be able to shrink the time to regain the capability for the United States to launch humans up to the International Space Station.
This capsule, the CST-100, can carry 7 people. It's designed to fly on any of 3 different rockets, the Falcon 9 from small company SpaceX, or the Atlas V or Delta IV made by the major firm United Launch Alliance. If the capsule holds up under all its initial tests, it could be ready for a flight on one of these rockets within the next 3 years.
Hopefully by as early as late 2013 or 2014, we could be launching the first demonstrations and the first crew shortly thereafter.
Bigelow has a similar timeline.
We hope to deploy the first modules for the first station in 2014. And we hope to deploy the modules for the second station in 2016. It's a very aggressive schedule. We recognize that.
5, 4. Go for main engine start. 3, 2, 1, 0. And ignition and liftoff of the Atlas V.
If all this comes to fruition, Kennedy Space Center and Cape Canaveral Air Force Station could see twice as many launches as they do today. United Launch Alliance currently has 685 workers in Florida, a number that could dramatically increase along with the number of rockets the company launches.
So if our rates double, a rule of thumb would be we'd need twice as many people to support a doubled rate. It wouldn't be quite that many because some management functions obviously wouldn't need to be duplicated. But there's a significant effect on staffing to launch rate. The more we launch, the more people we need to help process.
SpaceX is speeding along in its development of its Falcon 9 rocket and Dragon spacecraft. Musk's company already holds a $1.6 billion contract to launch cargo to the ISS for NASA. The company hopes it will be selected to fly astronauts to the outpost as well.
Off to my left here is a mock-up of the Dragon spacecraft. And it would look the same whether it was a cargo version or a crew-carrying version of the spacecraft. The first destination is going to be the International Space Station. The number of people on board depends on a lot of different factors, and we haven't quite pinned down the number that we would carry. But if you carried really, really small people, you might get 9 people in there. If you carry a larger range of folks, they're all wearing spacesuits, and you're just going back and forth to the International Space Station, we're probably talking 5 to 7.
If SpaceX gets a NASA contract to fly government astronauts and adds in NASA's cargo business and other flights for the Department of Defense, Musk says its Florida workforce could rise tenfold from 100 to 1,000. The wild card in this surge in launch traffic along the Space Coast is going to be Bigelow Aerospace. That's the Vegas-based company manufacturing modules for the world's first private space stations. While Cape Canaveral is their preferred launching area because of the number of flights they'll require, they're also looking at Wallops Island in Virginia as well as locations overseas.
The first station has a very light launch requirement. It's only 5 per year. It's very modest. The second station, though, is configured a little differently. The market base is a little different, and because those missions are different, it's going to require more launches. So together, the first and second stations are going to require between 20 and 25 launches per year. And if we can put the second station in service in 2017, then we'll be at that rate of 20 to 25 launches. And that doesn't count a third or a fourth or a fifth station.
Well, 20 to 25 launches a year would require us to create some additional facilities. With our current facilities, we can increase our launch rates substantially with just the addition of crew. For example, over here on Atlas, LC-41 was designed to handle 10 to 12 a year. We're currently doing maybe 3 or 4 per year. But the limitation right now is staffing and crew size, not the facility. When we've been in discussions with NASA about commercial crew, we have been strong advocates to create for Atlas an additional vertical integration facility and mobile launch platform. If we had that, we would double our launch rate capacity here for Atlas.
While Bigelow is still years away from launching his first space station, he sees a huge market for other countries that otherwise could not be involved in the space race. For smaller nations, it would bring the instant international prestige that goes along with being in space.
The problem is the International Space Station is an extremely exclusive club that is controlled by the Russians and the Americans. So it's not that easy to be able to find an accommodation on board the ISS. And we say, well, maybe there are 50 or 60 countries that if we are reasonable enough in our pricing and we're reasonable enough in being able to offer them good accommodations that are reliable and safe and offer them better access, that there's a good potential business in that.
Bigelow's space station is based on technology developed by NASA in the 1990s called TransHab. The idea behind TransHab was to have lightweight fabric modules that can be folded up into the nose cone of a rocket, then inflated in orbit. The technology is expected to cost much less than something like the International Space Station. The outer skin is made of a material called Vectran. The stuff is particularly resistant to damage from tiny rocks and hunks of junk floating in space.
It turns out that they are safer to be in than the aluminum cans in the International Space Station from a ballistic standpoint and from a radiation standpoint as well.
Bigelow, a real estate mogul who owns the Budget Suites of America hotel chain, has already injected $200 million of his own money into the project.
I'm willing to spend several hundred million more so long as I see progress, so long as I don't see something that strangles our potential to succeed.
NASA scrapped the Transhab plan in 2000, and Bigelow purchased the rights to the patents developed by NASA. He has 2 space station prototypes, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, orbiting the Earth right now.
If it hadn't been for our Russian friends, those spacecraft would not be in orbit today, because America had no rocket that we could use within reason. Either the rockets were too unreliable, or too small, or far too large, and way too expensive.
Bigelow says he might already have private stations in operation if commercial space taxis were available to ferry people up there and back.
You know, where the gap has really been is you know, what is a commercially available capsule, and no one has one of those. Mr. Bigelow has been waiting for the marketplace to deliver that capsule for many years, and I think we've all become convinced that the market won't deliver it. The U.S. government, if it invests in a commercial capability, could make that available, and if that happens, then you know, that's the last big missing piece of the Bigelow project.
While SpaceX, Boeing, United Launch Alliance, and Bigelow have grand plans, what about the smaller upstarts in the Mojave? These are the companies seeking ways to put the average person into space. Virgin Galactic's billionaire founder Sir Richard Branson is on the case. He's enlisted Scaled Composites, the company that built this beauty, to build a fleet of space liners that will launch people on flights to space for $200,000. Spaceship Two, modeled after its pioneering predecessor, will hold as many as 7 passengers. The spacecraft gets its start attached to White Knight 2, a carrier airplane that can reach altitudes of 60,000 feet. Way up there, it'll unleash Spaceship Two, which will rise more than 5 times that height to reach space.
Today you happen to arrive on a day when White Knight 2 was flying, and it appeared to be making practice high-angle approaches. Because the cockpits are identical to the spaceship, the pilots can actually do real-time approach training, very similar to how NASA uses the G2s for shuttle approaches for the shuttle crews.
Between 50 and 100 tests will be done before customers can fly on Spaceship Two. Meanwhile, a few hangars down, Jeff Grayson's X-Corp Aerospace is looking to sell similar flights for half the price, $95,000. Grayson was also a member of a committee called together by President Obama. The group's job was to give options for NASA and America's space program after the shuttle fleet was retired. It was from this committee's report that the president based his future space plan. Grayson's commercial craft, known as the Lynx, is in its testing phase. It could be ready for commercial flights within the next few years.
The Lynx is a very airplane-like vehicle, and it's winged, and it takes off horizontally from a runway and lands horizontally as a glider on a runway. It is all rocket-powered. It doesn't have supplementary jet engines or anything like that, so we take off under the rocket thrust from the runway. It's about 24-foot wingspan and a little less than 40 feet tip to tail. And it seats 1 pilot and either 1 participant or a payload in the right side of the vehicle.
Like the barnstorming days of early commercial airplanes, the first to ride in these new small spaceships are expected to be wealthy folks. As the number of flights goes up, the price per seat is expected to come down. How far? To the point where people who now pay tens of thousands of dollars for adventure vacations might opt instead to fly into space.
There are a lot of people for whom space is very important, and their reasons for that differ from person to person. But for most people who are interested in doing this, it's not a joyride. It's not a roller coaster. It's them having the same sense that I have that space is important, that we're at the beginning of an era and not at the end of one, that there's something new happening, the beginning of the next great adventure for people, possibly, and they want to have been there. They want to be a part of it. They want to participate. They want to be among those who help make that happen. That's very powerful motivation, and I have no doubt that there'll be people for whom this will be their dream of a lifetime. So it's not for the ultra-rich, and the price will come down with time.
So where does all this leave the future space workers of America? With the shuttle program set to end next year, and with a gap of several years before space taxis will be up and running, new science and engineering graduates will almost certainly find an unfriendly job market.
I try to paint an optimistic picture for them and point out the alternatives, and I try to let them know that in the future, NASA will not be the only way to get into space and not be the only space agency for which an engineer can work. I said they need to keep their eyes open on the private companies also. But in reality, there could be a real shortage of jobs for these young people coming out of college.
Like any drastic change, it will get worse before it gets better. I'm hopeful that the move to the private sector will open up a huge job market of which I can take place in, but I never thought we'd come to this point. I thought that we'd always be the top of the game, top of the mountain as far as space flight goes, but it's going to take a few years and we'll get back.
There's so much opportunities that we are at the surface of a giant expanding bubble, if you will, of opportunities with my generation, I think, for the more research outside of orbit, cheaper to get to orbit and stay in orbit. I think we're at a really good position and a very exciting time.
The commercial launch industry could end up flying more rockets than ever from Cape Canaveral in just a few years. For an area being hit by layoffs now, that's not much solace, but it means jobs may return in the future.
The number of jobs, that's yet to be determined. So depending on how we end up, we'll see how many jobs we can attract, but I think there's definitely an opportunity to bring work here to Florida.